Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. Don Watkins and Stefan Henna took over last week, and they are here today, but they're joined by me. Hey, Don. Hey, Stefan.
Hey, Alex.
Hey.
So let's jump right into the stories. Although I guess before we go into the stories, I should say that there's a new video this week that I did, and it's called What's the Deal with the Green New Deal? It's released and produced by Prager University. And as I'm speaking, it has over 200,000 views in about a day on the internet. And I hope that listeners check it out and spread it. It's about 5.5 minutes long. And I worked hard to put as much good content in that 5.5 minutes as possible so that you could share it with people, particularly people who are thinking about energy issues in the elections next year. So check that out. Just search Alex Epstein Green New Deal. Probably the best place to do it is YouTube, and you will find it. Okay, Don, what is the first story you want to talk about today?
Well, the Green New Deal had kind of shoved the carbon tax off the agenda for a while, but now that's starting to change. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are introducing competing bills in order to put a carbon tax on the United States. Senator Christopher Coons, Representative Francis Rooney, who's a Republican, and Representative Dan Lipinski have all introduced carbon tax bills over the last week. And those are, they're actually joining two other bipartisan measures that were proposed earlier in this year in the House and the Senate. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is that as Republicans are becoming more supportive of a carbon tax internally, we've actually become more opposed in the last few months. And in previous episodes of Power Hour, we've spoken about our fundamental objection that when you're making energy more expensive, you're depriving us of all the benefits of affordable energy, including all of the productive achievements and job creation that would have happened absent those higher energy prices. But I wanted to raise at least one new point, new to me anyway. And Alex, if there's any additional things you want to bring up, that would be great. But one of the arguments, particularly conservatives who support it will raise, is that a carbon tax will allegedly encourage innovation in energy. There'll be an incentive for clean energies to come along once we start making hydrocarbons pay for the alleged, full impact that they have on society. But it's actually anti-innovation, because what a carbon tax is really doing is it lowers the incentive to develop affordable energy sources. So like, imagine we said, let's put 100% tax on gasoline powered cars, and this will encourage us to shift to battery cars. Well, it's certainly not going to encourage battery car makers to be able to make their cars affordable. It'll be exactly the opposite, because they no longer have an incentive to bother trying to drive down prices, since affordable cars have basically been banned. And so if you want carbon-free energy to become cheap, which would be wonderful. I mean, the worst thing in the world you could do was to make today's cheap energy from fossil fuels expensive.
I mean, one example I've read that I think is a good example, and the whole article is worth reading. There's a good article by a guy named Oren Cass called "The Carbon Tax Shell Game," which I highly recommend. It really breaks down the issue better than anything else I've seen. And one point he makes is that Europe already has a huge equivalent of a carbon tax. If you look at the gasoline prices in Europe, or diesel prices in Europe, they're something like twice what we pay in the US. And there hasn't been some amazing revolution there. One thing this points to is that fossil fuels, for most purposes, including most people, is by far the lowest cost way of producing the power that people want. So you just think about producing electricity in China, producing power for a harvester, producing power for an airplane. There's just this huge gap between what people have figured out how to do efficiently and profitably using hydrocarbons or fossil fuels, and then what they figured out to do or haven't figured out to do with other things. So there's just these huge gaps, and people are trying to act like, oh well, if we just pass this little tax, then oh well, then we'll switch over to the other thing. But there has to be a recognition that the reason that fossil fuels are overwhelmingly the world's source of energy, the reason that they're the fastest growing source of energy, is because most of the time, for most purposes, they are by far the cheapest, if not the only way to generate the power that people want. And so if that's not acknowledged, then people just they just propose all these things, and then in practice what happens is these things just they make fossil fuels more expensive, but people still use fossil fuels. And we should really appreciate that people using fossil fuels, I mean different kinds of forms of producing power using fossil fuels, there it's really remarkable how low cost they can give us power for, and that enables us to have power in every aspect of life. And that's a great thing, and we're used to it and we take it for granted, but it's really an amazing thing that for any activity in the world we want to do, there's a low cost way to use machines, including low cost power, to do it. And that's just something that is it's not at all something to assume, oh well, somebody else can just do it some other way just as cheaply. Like sometimes there's this view that, oh well, we're just going to get other technologies at the same cost as fossil fuels. But I mean, what makes you think that you can do that? I mean, what makes you think it's possible on a given time scale? It may not be possible on a given time scale for many energy purposes. It's not like what fossil fuels cost is just some prescribed amount that every technology can theoretically equal. No, it's that like the best technology, it's what the best technology has achieved. So maybe the best technology can achieve more. That's definitely possible. Or maybe there's a transformative technology, probably involving nuclear, that can do even better at some point. But what we've achieved with fossil fuels in terms of like universal low cost power, there's just nothing like it. And all of these discussions around carbon tax and everything else are trying to evade that. And they're trying to act like there's a way to restrict fossil fuel power that doesn't involve a huge disempowering of the world. And right now, there is no such thing. And the closest thing over the coming decades would probably be to decriminalize nuclear. And they don't even want to do that. Stefan, what's your first story?
Well, July 29th was Earth Overshoot Day, at least according to the what I call Neo-Malthusian organization Global Footprint Network. And since the 1980s, they are calculating how much of the Earth natural resources humanity sort of uses each year. And according to them, we are right now using 1.75 Earth every year in terms of resource consumption. And so the way they do this is
What do they qualify as as a natural resource?
yeah, so they are looking up something like forest regrowth and soil health and biodiversity and so on, and they are making sort of this index with what they call an ecological footprint. So they calculate how much humans are consuming in terms of quote unquote natural resources, and the details are a bit complex, but so they are then comparing that to how much we use, and then they have as a result that we are overusing the planet as such. And so as I said, they are indicating that we are using too much of the world's forest. We are deforesting the planet, and the soil erosion problem, it gets worse and worse, and we lose a lot of biodiversity. And of course, we emit too much CO2 into the atmosphere, which is also then more than the natural systems can compensate for in terms of CO2 sinks, like forests, for example. And so this is they do this every year, and every year this day moves a little further to January 1st, of course, because we're using more and more resources on the planet. And so former Power Hour guest Mike Schellenberger from Environmental Progress has an interesting Forbes article on this, where he sort of debunks this metric of the ecological footprint on its own battlefield. So he has a paper out from 2013, I believe, where he actually shows that, hey, the forests are getting healthier and the soil quality is getting better. And so we've solved a lot of the alleged problems that we run into with this. And so my take is, yeah, that's true. And it's important to make these points. But you can also see this in a very empirical way, because the Global Footprint Network asserts that richer nations are consuming resources at a higher rate. So, for example, an American will sort of reach the Earth Overshoot day much earlier in the year than someone living in Cuba, for example, right? And so we know empirically that it's the poor nations that rely on something like wood for energy that run into problems with environmental degradation. They are consuming like a local limited resource like forests or fresh water and so on. And then they have big problems. But in developed nations, actually, we are sort of solving the problems along the way. So we create far more fresh water than we need, and we create far more healthier soils, and we can, shrink the acreage used to feed our populations and so on. So we are sort of solving this. And yeah, that's an important point to make. Of course, it's sort of debunked, but I think it's important to also stress why these neo-Malthusians always get this resource issue wrong. And this is what the reason is, because most people get resources wrong, and so we see this, or most people see this as sort of, there's a given a resource stockpile that nature provides us, and it regrows it at a certain rate, and that is sort of a God-given, metaphysical fact. And we can change that. We can just take care that we don't overuse it. And this is, of course, a totally wrong view, as Alex stated in his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. We are actually resource creators as humans, at least at a high energy technological civilization. So if you think about certain types of resources like aluminum or genetically modified organisms that we use in modern agriculture, these were not in existence, before the modern era. And so we are creating these technologies and these resources that actually enable us to live independent of these natural cycles of replenishment. So if you think of a primitive society that lives off agricultural land, if they exhaust their soils, or if they have a problem with using too much water than is replenished naturally, they run into problems. But a modern technological society will create more and more resource abundance by artificial means. So the reason why we are richer and more productive and can actually choose to whether we want to keep a forest area or turn it into an agricultural area, even if we have an increasing population, we can actually we do this because we become more productive with better technology. And I think this particular ideology portraying humans as these parasites, destroying nature by their lifestyles, is a very dangerous thing, because this is one of the few things that could actually destroy humanity, right? Because when we restrict our resource use and we stagnate and stop making progress and stop making technology better and more productive, we could actually stagnate to the point where we run out of options. We are doing the same things over and over again, like the renewable ideal, the green ideal would tell us. We're doing the same things over and over, and we stagnate and we don't grow and don't make things better. And then ultimately, we might run into problems like an animal that doesn't have a strategic mindset and cannot adapt to changing conditions out of a sudden. And then we have no option. We don't have the technology to do things differently if we need to. So this is actually a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy to me, where if we follow the leadership of these Malthusian green thinkers, we would actually, destroy ourselves by some resource problem that we otherwise wouldn't have.
I think it's interesting to think about what would happen if we had had the global footprint network giving us guidance in previous eras. So imagine during the Iron Age, when they're just figuring out how to get iron and how to use it. And they say, well, by our current knowledge of iron, this is completely unsustainable. Like we're going to run out of iron at some point. And part of it is when you're starting to develop something, you don't know much about it. And any given stage, you know less than you'll know in the future. So what they're basically saying is that any with basically no new technology are you going to somehow know, oh well, we can somehow do this indefinitely in the future forever, and every element of it we can do forever in the future. If you have this idea of repetitiveness or repeatability, then you're just not going to do anything. And that's what they're basically saying with new technologies. And you could certainly apply this to solar and wind and the materials in there and just say, yeah, we can't keep doing this because we're going to run out of uh, X, Y, or Z. Or, what you'll end up doing is you'll end up using just primitive technologies that are in what, and this is what they want. I mean, they want us to use primitive technology, and then they want there to be very few of us. And yeah, at a certain point, if there are very few of us and we don't consume much, then yeah, we can live like animals, which is the idea here. So the idea is that humans are animals, and so they judge it as, well, we're just doing these behaviors, and if we project these behaviors repeating in the future, and then that wouldn't be able to work indefinitely, then those behaviors are wrong now, versus the mindset that no, any given group of people should be consuming according to what's best for them now and then in the relevant future. And then part of that is when people are free, then they can either use the methods that people were using 10 years ago, or they can use new methods. And almost always those methods are better, but it may be the case that, well, for certain things, the older methods were better, but there was a limited supply. Like the people who used a lot of bat guano for fertilizer, I mean, maybe that was better in some ways than modern synthetic fertilizer, but still, they had a right to use that. And I think every generation has a right to use the world around them in the way that they think is best for their lives, and then they leave the next generation a whole bunch of knowledge and a whole bunch of wealth that then the next generation can either repeat some of the old ways or use new ways. And that kind of progressive way of life has just been amazing. But it really is the kind of thing where people need to understand what it means to be a human. Because if they have this idea of we want to repeat everything and we want to be sustainable in the sense of repeatable, then as Stefan mentioned, it can lead to just stagnation, and it can lead to the restriction of the freedom to develop and use the earth. And then if you don't have the freedom to develop the earth, then you really start running out of things. Don, what's your next story?
In September, New York is going to host the most high-profile summit on climate since the 2015 UN conference that led to the Paris Agreement. And already the conference or the summit is making headlines. And in this case, it's making headlines because Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish climate activist, has announced that she's going to cross the Atlantic Ocean in August with a 2-week trip in an open cockpit racing yacht to attend the meeting. And the reason she's doing this is because she doesn't fly because of the greenhouse gases from air travel. And I actually find this stunt really revealing. And I mean, first of all, like, we have to keep in mind that this boat was made with fossil fuels. Like, everything about it was made possible and manufactured and made affordable by fossil fuels. The second is the boat is actually completely unsafe to use without fossil fuels. So the New York Times points out that although it's outfitted with solar panels and underwater turbines to generate electricity, safety rules require that these kinds of boats have motors and generators aboard in case of trouble, like a broken rudder near the shore. And the team keeps them sealed and only for emergencies. But I mean, I think it's revealing that, in an emergency, it's only fossil fuels that they can rely on to save them. But even if you set that aside, if you read about like what this boat trip will entail, the Times points out there's no kitchen, refrigeration system, air conditioning, or showers. The guy who's boated is said there's really zero comfort on this boat. For 2 weeks, Thunberg will eat mostly freeze-dried and vacuum-packed meals, and that the crossing will involve choppy waters or worse. And of course, none of this would be able, you couldn't supply fast, affordable, safe, scalable travel this way. And so, I mean, my take on this is Thunberg is showing the world just how miserable she wants to make it.
Yeah, I mean it's a good illustration because there's so much reliance on fossil fuels for the manufacturer and for even the materials and for the backup, even then, the experience is unbelievably expensive and unbelievably low quality. So you think about what it means to have a competitive product on the market. It's you figure out I can make a profit by producing something really valuable at a really low cost. So then people will buy it because they get a lot of value for, in their view, very relatively low money, and then you figure out how to produce it for even less than they're willing to pay for it. And so you just always have this tendency, when you're out competing things, it's always you're looking for how do I have the same or better result at the same or lower price. And then you think about what the result of traveling across the Atlantic is. I'll just give my own perspective. I mean, my perspective for traveling across the Atlantic, particularly on business, is I want to be able to do it in a way that is cheap. So it doesn't cost me that much. It doesn't cost me that much in terms of money, but even more important, it doesn't cost me that much in terms of time. And then even during the time that it takes, part of the quality is that I have access to things like the internet and digital technology and whatnot. And so this is just saying, I mean, just imagine with our business, part of our business is speaking. And then somebody says to me, hey, I've got a speaking engagement for you, but you're not going to be able to work for 2 weeks because you're going to have to go on this boat, and you might have the battery that you came in with, and you're not going to be accessible. And oh, by the way, instead of getting paid to speak, we're going to deduct this travel fee, and we need to pay all of these people's livelihoods to take you. So actually, it's going to cost, fill in the number, right? But like tens of thousands of dollars or whatever it is. And then also, of course, you have to pay off the cost of this very expensive, eco-friendly boat. So it's basically just you're getting an experience of very uncomfortable travel, incredibly unproductive travel that takes a huge amount of time and costs an incredible amount of money. And so the only reason that she can do this is that she's in a fossil fueled civilization. And so for one person to be a parasite to do this kind of stunt, uh, in a sense, other people can afford it. But I even wonder who's paying for it. So I agree. This is a perfect illustration of how the world that they talk about building, A, they can't even build it without fossil fuels, and B, more importantly, it is a world that is not an enjoyable place to live in, and for most people, not a possible place to live in the sense that if everyone tried to live this way and we were forced to try to live this way, then a lot of people would have much shorter lives. Stefan, what's your next story?
Michigan fights its energy suppliers. So there's a Canadian energy transportation company named Enbridge, and they are struggling to update its Line 5 pipeline that transport light crude and natural gas liquids through Michigan. And so this pipeline is crossing the Straits of Mackinac, which connects Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And this is a sort of the point where the government or the newly elected governor disagrees with the pipeline company. So this pipeline is over 60 years old, and the company is planning to build a tunnel under the Straits of Mackinac. And this plan was so to improve safety and update the pipeline. And this plan was actually approved by the Michigan legislature and the outgoing Republican governor Rick Snyder in 2018. And it's now in jeopardy because the newly elected Democratic governor Gretchen Whitmer has made it a campaign issue to stop this kind of pipeline thing going through her state. And she wants now to shut down the existing pipeline within 2 years. And this is too short a time to complete the replacing update. And so this is a 645-mile pipeline that supplies over 50% of Michigan's propane needs. And it has never leaked in its history, even though it's over 60 years, as I said. So, and this is now going to the courts because Enbridge said, okay, we can do this. We can supply Michigan with propane, and we can update this. And we were promised that this deal is done. But they said we prefer an agreement outside the courts, of course, because who wants to fight the government, right? And so two Democratic presidential runners, Jay Inslee and Bernie Sanders, took the opportunity to call for a shutdown of this pipeline for good. And Senator Sanders just recently took the opportunity at a quote unquote anniversary of one of the largest inland spills in US history of oil, which is a Kalamazoo River oil spill. And this is also connected to Enbridge because this is a different pipeline by Enbridge. And to my knowledge, I tried to search around a little bit. Although this was over 1 million-gallon spill into a river, nobody got killed or injured or something. And they cleaned up this spill in about 5 years and were fined over $177 million and had to pay for all of the cleanup work. So essentially, maybe a bit of wildlife suffered, and Bernie Sanders got a talking point for his campaign trail, but nothing more happened from this, largest spill in U.S. history. So and this pipeline seems to be much safer in this pipeline in question. But Bernie Sanders went to Twitter and said, today, with the climate crisis worsening, we must shut down Line 5 pipeline in Michigan and ban all new fossil fuel infrastructure. So he's not even particularly concerned about the safety, allegedly, but he wants to just take this opportunity to shut down another infrastructure project related to fossil fuels. And as the Detroit News notes in their article covering this, they say, like Inslee, Sanders did not specify how he would ensure adequate propane supply to the Upper Peninsula and other parts of Michigan if Line 5 is shut down. So again, the Greens have no plan for this. They don't care about how energy is supplied to anyone. They just want to shut down fossil fuels, or at least they want to position themselves as radically anti-fossil fuels. So I find this very horrible. Enbridge got a deal from the previous administration in Michigan and from the legislature, and this is immediately in danger if someone radical gets elected into office and just can shut down your pipelines. And interestingly, the new government in Michigan said, "Oh, we will look into the paperwork of the original easement in the 1960s or in the 1950s actually, and we'll find something." So something to that. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's the essence of what they said. We'll find something to bring into court to challenge the whole operation of this. And they are apparently okay with just shutting down the propane supply to Michigan. And so I find this is kind of a miracle, given all this, that the voters who brought Whitmer into office are still supplied with the energy they need. It's just short of a miracle that all of these companies that are harassed and abused in this way to make a perfectly safe pipeline even safer at their own expense, and they will still deliver all the energy Michigan needs.
Did you guys talk last week about the Con Ed blackouts?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we should definitely cover that story at some point. I mean, you're just short version is you're having blackouts in New York City that I think are clearly connected to these anti-fossil fuel policies, both development policies and infrastructure policies. And it's just there's no awareness of this. Just to put this into context, just think about the 1970s. So in the 1970s, there was an Arab oil embargo, particularly in 1973, and it it's not actually true that that caused the whole problem, but that was connected to a problem of having huge supply interruptions of oil-based fuels to people. And the thing people associate it with is gas lines. Like there are these huge lines at the gas station, and people could only go to gas stations on certain days, and just huge amounts of life was shut down. And just, one of the worst economic periods in American history. And this is one reason why, in terms of national security, people are rightly concerned about disruptions to oil supply. Even in Iran right now, people are recognizing that. And yet we are talking about voluntary disruption to oil supply, that we want to willingly make it hard or impossible to transport oil from where it is to where it's needed. And this is the opposite of a competitive approach of technologies, because a competitive approach would be, well, yeah, I think we have something better. We have something that can, with lower emissions, generate just as much or more energy at low, if not lower prices. And so we're going to build that infrastructure. And then at a certain point, the pipelines won't be necessary. And maybe even the people who invest in the pipelines will take a bath because they were overly optimistic about the pipelines. Like that would be totally fine. And that would be a good kind of approach. But instead, it's saying we're promising that we're going to replace the value of the pipelines. We've never come close to doing that. I mean, essentially, we talked about Greta Thunberg's, however you pronounce her name's, like, boat, in terms of just our alternatives, our horrible alternatives that are much lower quality and much higher cost. But we're going to get rid of today's leading competitor, and in some sense only competitor, and we're going to destroy that. And then we're going to outcompete it, or at least outcompete what's left, although they don't even know all of their projects require oil to build, among other things. I think it's really, really remarkable how much with the Democrat candidates, this is just this idea of keep it in the ground and stop the existing system has become a focus, and with less and less uh, pretense that, well, no, we really are gonna, like, we can create a system that can outcompete the current system. And what I think one real possibility, if these guys get elected, is that you'll have things much worse than even the blackouts in New York, and you'll just have massive supply disruptions. And then I think there will be a then you'll see huge suffering. I mean, and people dying, and I really do not want this to happen, but you'll see that. And then I think there will be some recognition of some perspective on the green movement and what they call, like, climate crisis. Like, there will be an energy crisis and an industry crisis and a life crisis, and people will see what that's like. And I really do not want it to get there. So part of our job is to explain to people how the system works, so that they are afraid of that and can avoid it without it happening. But I do think there's a real possibility that it will happen. If it does happen, it's equally important that we can explain what has happened. Just as we can explain what might happen now, we can explain what has happened, so that there's a better chance that people will take the lessons from it. Because the further we are away from the 70s, the more people think, oh, that doesn't apply anymore. There couldn't be this problem, or oil doesn't matter as much. And, like, no, oil matters. We use more oil now than we did back then. Oil matters more than just about everything. Don, what's your next story?
Well, throughout this episode and through many of our episodes, one of the themes we keep coming back to is the way in which the green movement is hostile towards human flourishing. And it certainly, in my experience discussing this with people, and I hear it many times when you're interviewed, Alex, that gets pushback. And now, if you actually read them, particularly when they're talking to each other, I think it's very apparent that, like, their goal is not to promote human flourishing, but I think it's also apparent just from their policy goals. And so I wanted to highlight two more pieces where I think this really comes through. One in particular, we can be pretty brief on because we talked about it in conjunction with Greta Thunberg not flying, but an article from Spiked Online called "The War on Cheap Flights" is highlighting a debate that's going on in the UK right now about taxing travel, and particularly air travel on the grounds that like this is not green, and which is true. I mean, every form of travel has a huge amount of impact, whether it's obviously, the use of fossil fuels, but even just the infrastructure, how much, the roads, even if you had, we talked about in Germany, this idea of like electrifying all of the driving space, which would be a ton of impact. Even EVs, that one of the biggest sources of air emissions from cars doesn't come from the exhaust, but the wear on the tires, which turns into emissions. And you cannot travel without impact. And part of what the Greens are arguing here is that it's precisely we should be traveling less and penalizing the people who travel the most. Then a article that just came out today in the Wall Street Journal. This is from Richard Tren, who's a co-founder of Africa Fighting Malaria. He has quite a powerful piece where he talks about how Target Malaria, which is a Gates Foundation supported research effort, is trying to develop genetically modified sterile mosquitoes. And the goal is to reduce those populations because mosquitoes spread malaria, which is one of the deadliest diseases on Earth. And a coalition of 40 leading environmental and civil society organizations, he points out, is demanding the product be shut down immediately. And this shouldn't be a surprise because this movement has a long history of opposition to genetic technology. And the one example he cites is an example that's come up, I think, in some of the older episodes of Power Hour, which is the efforts by Greenpeace and others to stop golden rice, which could save up to 2 million people a year, mostly kids, from early death and crippling blindness from vitamin A deficiency. And he points out that a petition signed by 144 Nobel laureates called them to environmentalists to end these campaigns and actually accused Greenpeace, which I think is true, of crimes against humanity. But then he goes on to talk about something that I'm not that familiar with, which is this new trend of agroecology. And it's a radical approach to food production that excludes modern farming techniques, including synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, modern hybrid seeds, and even mechanization. Agroecology, he says, explicitly promotes peasant agriculture and the superior wisdom of indigenous peoples. And now you might think, all right, of course, every movement has its crazy ideas, but this has actually been officially adopted by the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, of the United Nations, the UN Development Program, and the UN Environment Program. And FAO Steering Committee member Miguel Altieri, he describes the Green Revolution, which is the agricultural revolution that we usually credit with saving over 1 billion lives. He called it a failed project that undermined the ability to address the root causes of hunger, whatever those are, and put global, I'm sure it's capitalism, and put global food production under the control of a few transnational corporations bolstered by free trade agreements. And according to FAO's data, the author points out, though, the Green Revolution increased food-wide supply by hundreds of calories per person each year, even when the global population more than doubled. And this was actually a recent study promoted by agroecologists acknowledged that their policies would reduce food production by 35% in Europe, and they nonetheless endorse it. And so, I mean, I think you see the green ideal. Don't eat, don't travel, don't protect yourself from disease, live or rather die like primitives.
Another aspect to the green movement that I've been thinking of a lot lately is just how anti-freedom it is, in terms of not just, there's no right to transform nature. I think that's the key way in which is anti-freedom, but also, I mean, related, it's anti-free market, as in anti-freedom of production and trade. And if you think about agriculture, so we think about, we talk about the green revolution, and notice it's criticized in part because it's transnational corporations involved. But what that really means is that people free to produce in trade were able to discover and put into practice methods of food production that allow billions of people to get the food that they need daily, and that's an amazing achievement. It's the achievement of really millions of people who are coordinating uh, together, including what they're really doing is they're figuring out ways to make a profit. They're figuring, each farmer is trying to figure out, okay, how can I produce food that's worth X to people and then make it for less than X. And there's just this incredible process of all of these people pursuing profit, which from a certain perspective means pursuing a resource efficient way of producing things. And that's what has led to this amazing abundance of food. But it's important that it's millions of people working in coordination, and that they're free to discover the best methods, and that they are also left to fail when they're wrong. When you think about just how these issues are being discussed with the UNEP and these, with the UN. I mean, the UN is supposed to be it doesn't have any exact authority, but it's a government type thing. So this is a kind of government planning approach where we bring together a gang of experts, and they say, let's say it's 100 people or 500 people or 10 people, whatever it is. It's some very small number of people who are saying, hey, we can dictate how food should be produced. And so we have this idea, and I'm sure, and this idea is a horrible idea because it's an idea that's against transforming nature. So it's going to be just destructive because it's just got this anti-production root to it. But also, how the hell are they going to know what even if with the new method of like what global food production should look like and how it can actually be efficient and profitable for billions of people? Like there's no way they can have any idea. So in practice, it's just, I just want to stress that we've with these global issues, we've gotten into the practice of just assuming that these government agencies and committees of experts can uh, not only it's okay to pick these green ideologies, but that they can somehow plan the global economy in some way, even if their idea was right. And so what we have is this combination of deliberately bad economic ideas, and then people trying to practice them in ways that are impossible to be truly efficient, as in having a few central people figuring it out for billions of people instead of leaving the billions of people to figure it out for themselves, including with the millions of people who are specialists in how to produce different kinds of agriculture for different purposes, for people of different kinds of means and preferences, given the availability of different resources at a given time. That's the kind of thing that is that you need billions of free people to do. It's nobody can figure it out in advance. All right, let's do one more story. Stefan, pick a story, and let's focus on brevity because we only have a little bit more time.
Okay, so Ethiopia is saving the world by planting trees. And a shout out to our friend Kirk who pointed me to the story. So, according to
So Ethiopia, you said, right?
Ethiopia, yes. Sorry for my
Got it.
pronunciation. So, according to the BBC, Ethiopia has probably broken the world record in trees planting by volunteers by planting 350 million trees in one day. And this is part of the Green Legacy initiative by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, I hope I pronounce this correctly, to counter the effects of deforestation and climate change. And I was curious about the priorities of this government in Ethiopia because it's one of the poorest countries in the world. It has over 100 million in population and a relatively low electrification rate. The average Ethiopian uses less than 10% of the energy the average American uses. And the nominal GDP is something about $800 per year. And so this is a very poor country. None of the development metrics are anywhere near that of a developed country. And although some progress has been present in recent years, this is very there are huge challenges to this country, to say the least. So, and as the BBC reported, critics of Mr. Abiy said he is using the campaign to distract the public from the challenges his government is facing, including ethnic conflicts, which have forced some 2.5 million people from their homes. And so I would say, yeah, okay, planting trees, we get it. That's a climate policy, but wasting manual labor on that by volunteers um, is not going to cut it in Ethiopia. They have different problems on their plate, and the country is actually too poor to make any difference in climate policies or global emissions. Right. So reforestation might be important down the road, because recently there has been some deforestation, like significant parts of the country have experienced drought, and has been deforestation going on. But the underlying cause of all of this is, of course, the poverty of Ethiopian citizens, right? So this is the first thing you need to fix, because otherwise, you can't really in the long term change things like the forest area in your country, and two, no matter what the climate or weather pattern in your locality will be by 2050 or 2100, if your population is poor, a lot of people will suffer under any climate. So this can be a priority of the government of such a impoverished country.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but very understated. Because I just think about, and this is even an understated analogy, but imagine that you have like some politician says, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go to the ghettos of America, and I'm gonna force everyone in the ghettos to spend, 1 day a week. Each person in the ghetto has to spend, let's say, 12 hours uh, digging holes in the ground and filling them back up. And like that's, and you would say, whoa, whoa, whoa. First of all, that's not probably the most valuable use of that's not even not the most valuable use of their time, but they don't have time to spare. Like, these are people who need all the time they can get to produce, and they're already poor. So what's happening in Ethiopia? I mean, you're taking poor people and you're taking away their time, and you're taking away their time to do something that is not even remotely their highest priority. So it has, and I don't know exactly is this all voluntary? Is there some sort of compulsion? But I mean, if the government is leading it, there's some sort of compulsion one way or another. So either some poor person is paying for them to do this directly, or they're basically just being enslaved to, plant trees. But that's basically just digging holes in the ground and then putting some dirt around the trees. So it's just, I mean, you are just wasting the time and money of poor people who and making them even poorer. And this is the opposite of being pro-human, and it's the opposite of being pro-freedom, and it's part of why being pro-freedom is essential to being pro-human, because when you have freedom, then individual human beings can be pro-human primarily for themselves, and they can actually act in a way that they judge to be in their interest. Whereas as soon as you have anti-freedom, even if the government says that it's acting in people's interest, it has no means of knowing what's in everybody's interest. And by the nature of the system, it's just going to sacrifice some people's resources and freedom for the alleged benefit of others, but doesn't even know what the benefit of those others is. So I just want to keep emphasizing that we can't separate being pro-human from being pro-freedom. So we need government policies that value human beings, and really how they value human beings is that they leave individuals free to pursue, life, or to, to live their lives and to have liberty, and to, create and to produce and trade property, and then to pursue happiness. So human flourishing and human freedom are inextricably linked. Okay, that is our show for the day. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail for us, you can email them to Don. He will take care of them. So he's at don@industrialprogress.net. Also, if you are interested in having a speaker at your organization, you can email don@industrialprogress.net. Or if you are an organization that wants help with messaging, email don@industrialprogress.net, and he will take care of you. To get on our mailing list, you can just go to alexepsteinlist.com. Also, that's probably the most important thing. Then you'll get notifications about Power Hour and everything else we are doing. And also, just one final reminder to watch the new Green New Deal video. What's the deal with the Green New Deal? So check that out on YouTube. Please share it widely. I know that some of you who listen to this work at companies with thousands of people. And so we might as well share it with those thousands of people. I think there's a real chance that this could reach 10 million people. And that seems like a nice round number to shoot for. So help us get there. Okay. Thanks everyone for listening. Some of us at least will be back next week. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.